My parents forced me to give my penthouse to my sister. When I refused, Dad slapped me, so I had always known I was the placeholder child, the one expected to comply in silence while my sister Claire basked in adoration. But I never thought they'd cross the line so completely. The penthouse was the only thing I had to show for my last thread of dignity. It was my grandmother's last gift to me, handed over because she saw the cracks in my smile and the weight of invisible wounds I carried. The day they asked me to surrender it to Claire, who needed it, apparently, for her upcoming marriage into wealth and influence, I felt the floor of the house I never belonged in crumble beneath me. When I refused, Dad snapped. His slap wasn't just flesh meeting flesh, it was history meeting climax. All the times I bit my tongue, bent my back, and became less so they could feel more. I walked out that night with nothing but my phone, keys, and a sense of liberation intertwined with rage. I didn't go to war, not with fists or harsh words, but with understanding. First, I consulted a lawyer, had the will enforced, and ensured the penthouse was legally mine. But that wasn't the revenge I wanted. What I wanted was acknowledgement of the damage, of the years they'd chipped away at my sense of self. So I crafted my revenge slowly, like a sculptor chiseling away at stone, revealing truth where denial once lay. I invited Claire over, not to lord the place over her, but to talk, to really talk. She cried that night, saying she never asked for favoritism. She always felt the pressure to play the perfect daughter. That admission was my turning point. I realized the system had harmed us both, just differently. I began documenting everything, every memory, every emotional bruise, and turned it into a memoir published anonymously online titled The Golden Child's Shadow. It wasn't bitter or cruel, it was honest, raw, and unfiltered. It went viral, resonating with countless readers who saw themselves in the unspoken corners of family dynamics. My parents eventually read it, their shame becoming palpable in their silence. Claire reached out again, this time with forgiveness, for herself, for me. My parents' social circle whispered, their perfect image cracked. They tried to call me. Each time, I let it ring. My revenge was never to hurt them. It was to show them what they'd done, publicly, undeniably, and without me ever losing my dignity. They couldn't force me anymore, couldn't slap me into submission. I had built something stronger than a penthouse. I had built my voice. The true revenge was in reclaiming my narrative and exposing the truth so that no slap, no guilt, no favoritism could silence me again. Months passed, and the penthouse became a sanctuary of peace I had never known, bathed in warm light and echoing with the soothing rhythm of water against glass panes. But what I didn't expect was how quickly my story, our story, would evolve beyond the internet. A film producer reached out, moved by the raw emotion of my anonymous memoir. They offered to adapt it into a psychological drama, wanting my input every step of the way. I hesitated at first. Wasn't the memoir enough? But something in me stirred. This wasn't about vengeance anymore. It was an opportunity to turn private pain into something meaningful. Something that could unpack those quiet house wars waged across dinner tables and holiday gatherings, the subtle crimes of emotional neglect and silent inequity. Around that time, Claire reached out again. She was pregnant, but glowing in a way I hadn't seen since childhood. She asked to meet, not in the penthouse, but at the small cafe our grandmother used to take us to. She looked exhausted, not from the pregnancy, but from the weight of finally seeing our parents for who they were, who they still tried to be. Claire confessed that since my memoir, everything at home had shifted. The air was tense, coated in unspoken guilt and defensive anger. Dad had lost his business partner after the scandal. Mother avoided any social setting where whispers would live louder than conversation. "I can't fix what they broke," she said, her eyes glistening. "But I want my child to grow differently, to know love isn't currency." I reached across the table, and for the first time in a long time, I held my sister's hand not as a rival, but an ally. I invited her and her husband to the premiere screening of the film adaptation, months later. They sat behind me in the theater, their presence a silent affirmation that cycles could be broken. The film was brutal, but beautiful. It didn't paint villains, only victims of an awful inheritance. The scene representing the slap came and went, and I heard Claire shift behind me. I didn't look. I didn't have to. She knew. After the credits rolled, we stood in clusters in the theater lobby, people coming up to me with shaky voices, giving thanks for putting into words what they couldn't. A few said it gave them permission to stand up for themselves, too. The night was electric, not with revenge, but with resonance. My parents didn't come. They received an invitation, of course. I sent it with a handwritten note. The truth is still the truth, even if whispered. I don't know if they watched the film later, but I imagine they did. Silence followed. Our first mutual peace. I bought a second apartment, smaller and closer to the outskirts of the city, where I hosted creative workshops for young women learning to claim their own narratives. I never sold the penthouse. It stood as proof, not of wealth, but transformation. Late one evening, sitting alone by the glass wall overlooking the city, I reflected on the strange alchemy of survival, that what nearly broke you can become what saves someone else. Claire sent me a photo a few weeks later, her newborn daughter wrapped in a blanket with stars. Her name is Hope, she wrote, and I smiled, feeling something soften within me that I didn't realize was still hardened. Hope. It was fitting, I thought. Not just her name, but the echo of a story no longer rooted in pain, but rebirth. And in that moment, I knew my revenge was complete. I didn't ruin them. I rescued myself. Hope was 2 years old when everything shifted again. Claire had grown into motherhood with grace, her once timid voice now laced with protectiveness and depth. We met often, family dinners at my penthouse, quiet afternoons in parks, where I found myself learning how to care without fear. But despite the small pockets of peace we built, I always felt a lingering shadow, an unfinished thread connecting me to our parents. I had ignored their attempts to reconnect, guarded against the emotional traps of nostalgia, but time softened even the hardest truths. One evening, I received a voice message from Mother. Not the usual placid, passive tone I grew up with. This was jagged, raw. Dad had suffered a stroke. He was alive, but his speech slurred, his movements slow. I sat on the floor, pressing my forehead to my knees, not out of grief, but confusion. Could I mourn a man who had never cherished me? Could forgiveness exist without validation? Claire begged me to visit, not for them, but for myself. I agreed, reluctantly. The house I walked into felt smaller than I remembered, choked with old shadows and silent photographs. Dad sat in a wheelchair, frail and sunken in a way that made me flinch. His eyes met mine, not with authority or expectation, but something painful in its familiarity. Regret. He tried to speak, words caught in a tangled slur, and I realized this was the only apology I would ever receive. It wasn't enough, but it was something. Mother sat across the room, head bowed in shame I had craved to see all my life, but now it just looked sad. I thought I would feel triumph. Instead, I felt heavy. That night, I returned to the penthouse and wrote a letter, not to them, but to Hope. May you grow in a house where love is abundant and silence is never weaponized, I wrote. I sealed it and decided to give it to her on her 18th birthday. Something in me shifted then. Not forgiveness nor reconciliation, but a release. I no longer needed them to understand what they'd done. The truth was living freely in the world, in film, in memoir, in me. A year later, at a film panel, I was asked if I'd ever go back, if I'd ever erase that slap, rewrite the pain. I looked out at the audience of wide-eyed faces and said, "No, pain is a beginning, not an ending. What matters is what we build from it." The applause felt like closure, though closure isn't final. It's fluid, like healing. A week later, I bought a piece of land overlooking the coastline, not as a retreat, but as an offering, to myself, to the next generation, to those silently enduring what I once endured. The project was called The Quiet House, a space for women to come and rebuild from trauma, to reflect and grow in peace. Claire joined me in shaping it, her legal expertise blending with my architectural eye. Hope's laughter echoed in the worksite, her curls bouncing as she toddled between tools and blueprints. She was the future. I was building a place where she would never question her worth. That night, as the sun dipped into the sea and the foundations of the quiet house were poured, I stood with Claire and watched the tide shift, the land accepting what we offered. No revenge could have tasted sweeter than this. This cycle dismantling, forgiveness with boundaries, creation born from devastation. I had finally built something bigger than the penthouse, larger than grief. I had built myself anew. 5 years later, the quiet house stood complete, a sprawling glass and wood sanctuary by the sea, where silence was no longer a weapon, but a balm, where rooms bore the weight of whispered secrets and emerged stronger for it. I walked its halls often, barefoot, feeling the cool, polished floors beneath me like a heartbeat, each corner a reminder that redemption could be built from ruin. Women came from everywhere, some angry, others numb, many afraid. We didn't fix them, because they weren't broken. We offered space, a clean breath, a place to name their bruises, visible and invisible, and to dream beyond them. On the first anniversary of its opening, we hosted a gathering under a canopy of warm lights and paper lanterns. Claire stood beside me, radiant, her daughter, now 7, chasing the sea breeze in a dress the color of dawn. Guests arrived slowly, some familiar, some strangers. I sat at a long wooden table, carving out space in my heart for the lives and stories that were no longer mine to carry. It was then that I saw her, Mother. She wasn't invited, yet she came, fragile, older than her years, her hands trembling as if she'd forgotten how to exist in a place not governed by control or decorum. She stood at the edge of the garden, uncertain, and for a moment I felt that old pang, the child waiting to be chosen, seen. But then I realized something. I wasn't waiting anymore. I walked toward her, not as a daughter seeking approval, but as a woman who had claimed her own life. We didn't speak at first. The breeze carried the sound of waves and laughter, and I saw tears glisten in her eyes. Finally, she whispered, "I'm sorry. Not for one thing, everything. For the silence, the favoritism, the betrayals wrapped in the guise of family duty." I nodded, and that was enough. Forgiveness didn't need drama, it needed honesty. We sat for a while, watching the horizon, 2 generations finally seeing the ocean instead of walls. Later, Hope climbed into my lap, her small arms circling my neck, her hair smelling of salt water and lemonade. "Auntie," she said, looking up at me, "Mummy says you built this so people can feel better." I smiled, a lump rising in my throat. "Not better. Free," I told her. That night, under a sky littered with stars, I lit a single lantern and watched it rise, carrying every pain I once thought permanent. The penthouse was still mine, the film still beloved, the memoir still read, but none of those defined me anymore. I was defined by this. The resilience turned to refuge, the pain turned to purpose. As the lantern drifted upward, I made peace with the girl I used to be, the one who had waited for affection that never came. She had survived, and in surviving, she had learned. Freedom isn't won from others, it's claimed from within. I stood, bathed in starlight and the quiet hum of newfound community, and felt the final threads of old grief loosen. The story was mine, the ending mine to choose. And this was it. Not revenge, not triumph, but liberation. The kind you build brick by brick, healing by healing, until you no longer recognize the cage you lived in. I stepped back into the house I built from brokenness, surrounded by people who had risen in their own ways, and smiled, because in the end, this was the home I had always deserved.